I'm going to talk about intrapreneurship. Now, honest, raise your hand if you have any idea, if you've even heard the term intrapreneurship before. Good. If you guys would all raise your hand, I'd say thank you very much, and go on to something else. And its relevance to academic medicine. And these disclosures will become important as I develop this talk. First of all, I'm a dean, so I always have to say whatever I say to you is my opinion alone and not that of my institution. The information that I'm going to relate to you today resulted from almost 3 decades of NIH funding. And I co-founded a company in order to do what I wanted to do, and that was to get a discovery to a patient. You'll see from my talk that there really are no other ways to do it other than to create a company or to work with a company, because commercialization of a discovery is something that is very expensive and very complicated. I always have to make sure that my conflicts of interest are clear in terms of disclosures. And most of you know about conflicts of interest. What you may or may not be aware of is something else called conflict of commitment. So when you do something like this, you have to be very clear with the institution about both conflict of interest and then your conflict of commitment, which has to do with how much time you're spending doing something that you're getting paid for a different way than the way you're getting paid for by the institution. And so I think it's really important to understand these things, because what you'll end up understanding is, contrary to the way that Dr. Allenbogen and I were raised in academia, there is no shame to moving to commercialization. We used to think, those guys that go to commercialization, they're not real academics, and nothing could be further from the truth. And I hope if there's one message that you leave with here today, that's the message. So what is academic medicine? You hear this term a lot. And, I kind of been thinking about this for a while as a dean. What is academic medicine? And it really is a diverse community, typically anchored to a university medical school that straddles the medical school and a health system. And that whole balance has changed dramatically over the past decade and continues to change. It used to be, a university owns the medical school and then owns the hospital. So it's everything is one. And the expectation is that, you can take care of a patient as well as you can run a hospital. And that would be a very wrong assumption. And so what happened at the University of Arizona, and this is public, I'm not betraying any secrets, is that many years ago, our practice plan went bankrupt, insolvent. And then somebody thought it'd be a good idea to take an insolvent practice plan and merge it to a university-owned hospital that was barely making it. And so what happened was both became insolvent, to the point where they were about to shutter down the medical school. They were certainly going to shutter down the hospital. They were talking to the faculty at the University of Arizona saying, you better go find a place to practice, and then we'll figure out how we can educate our medical students. And why did that happen? It happened because, we all grew up thinking, medicine is all about teaching medical students, training residents, advocacy for our patients, advocacy for all the right things. And the patients, we'll get to them when we can, because we're busy doing research, or we're busy doing something else, and that just doesn't fly anymore. And so the attention to patient care, the attention to dollars that come from patient care revenues to fund the academic mission is now more important than ever. And so if you lose that perception, you've lost the game before you start the game. So it's really important that we understand if academic medicine is going to survive, and it needs to survive, that we understand the relationship between the clinical operation, the clinical enterprise, and the academic enterprise. It's a construct that's designed to deliver on a tripartite mission of education, research, and patient care. And patient care has to be provided in the context of education and research. And that really is what defines academic medicine. So why is this so difficult increasingly to achieve? And why is it that less physicians and surgeons especially go into academic medicine? Well, first, and at the core of this, is the individual has to have the ability as well as the appetite for academic medicine. Without that, they're just going to go into private practice. The individual has to be at the right place at the right time and have the right opportunity to become an academic physician. And that has to do with mentorship, role models, et cetera, et cetera. There's no question that, to train to be an academic physician or surgeon, you have to put in extra time to train in research or in the science of education. And there are opportunity costs with that. By the time you're a resident, you're starting to, have a family, you have to worry about kids, you got to worry about stuff that you don't worry about when you're younger, whether you're a female or a male, it doesn't matter. You have, family commitments and stuff like that. So at that time, the extra time becomes real because there's an opportunity cost, whether it's financial or personal. There's obviously an incentive everywhere in the nation for work RVUs. And this could be a disincentive if you want to do something other than generate work RVUs, because it may have a direct impact on how much money you take home to your family. We just set an academic rate at the University of Arizona. The academic rate is lower than the clinical rate. And that's just the way it has to be. And so there has to be a commitment to do the academic work. Now, there's a whole bunch of caveats that make a lot of sense. For example, your clinical rate depends on your productivity. So if this year you do less than last year, your academic rate, your base goes down at most institutions. We just put in a new compensation plan. It's great, and it rewards productivity. But if you're not productive, it doesn't reward you, it penalizes you. Whereas the academic rate that uses the same AAMC benchmarks is stable. But it doesn't include call dollars. It doesn't include all the extra dollars that go into clinical rates. It's a decision that somebody has to make. You want to be an academic, you just have to make a decision as to what you're giving up to do that, because there's a lot to gain. But if you don't understand that, you're never going to be an academic physician. There's cost share. And I'm sure Dr. Allenbogen is very familiar with the fact, I had a ton of NIH funding. My cap was $190,000 a year. That's all the NIH pays. It doesn't pay any more than that. It doesn't matter if you're a neurosurgeon, transplant surgeon, it doesn't matter. So if you're making more than that, whatever you're making, hopefully you're making more than that as a neurosurgeon, or I go have a little chat with Dr. Allenbogen, the delta has to be paid by somebody else. That's called cost share. And that somebody else is your department. So your department has to be able to balance that. There are clinically active people that generate more RVUs, they may generate more dollars, and that gets shared so that you can support the academic mission. So you could be an academic physician and be 100% clinical, but you support the academic mission. You may not be good at it, you may not have an appetite for doing it, but the pride of enterprise, the fact that you belong to an academic department, the fact that the name of your department is up there at all the national meetings should be enough to say, you know what, I'm really good at clinical work and I'm going to do what I enjoy doing, but I want to be part of this academic team. There's an incremental dulling of the luster of academic medicine. It used to be, oh, you're academic, you're traveling the world and you're giving talks and doing all this stuff. there's less of that, but there's still a great luster, but sometimes it's harder to see. And there's a recent trend of academic medical centers pretending to be community hospitals and community hospitals pretending to be academic centers. Actually, Josh told me about this private-demics, which I'd never heard of. So, this is the trend. And so, the community hospitals think they're going to get better market share by somehow, giving the impression that they're academic. And then the academic medical centers have to, by necessity, pay attention to revenues and RVUs and all that stuff so they can survive. So these are the major hurdles to, having academic medicine continue to exist as it has. So what is a traditional academic career pathway? Well, you do some research, you write some papers as a medical student, you do some research projects as a resident, and you find a mentor. You spend some dedicated research time as a resident or a fellow. Then you get a job as an assistant professor at an academic institution. You write a few proposals for grants from either federal or other agencies, and you collaborate with people, and eventually you get some real funding in the form of an art grant or a VA merit, which is great because the pay lines are a lot easier to get, VA merits. And it's really more difficult to do this if you're really focused on clinical trials or devices. And then you get promoted and you get tenured and you build a research program. And that's where you bring in the U grants and the P grants. And those are the grants that build research empires within departments. So I'm going to switch gears a little bit and then talk about entrepreneurship. So when you saw intrapreneurship, you probably asked yourself, does this guy know how to spell? So entrepreneurship is a term that's been around forever, and it's a process by which an individual creates an opportunity to bring a new product or process to the market or to substantially improve on an existing product. And so the entrepreneur is an innovator who creates a new enterprise, a startup, often under incredible uncertainty, either bearing most of the personal and financial risks or alternatively partnering with other co-founders or with an existing corporate entity. So the definition of entrepreneurship is that the individual takes a lot, if not all, the risk. So if you do this and you have a startup as an entrepreneur, not an intrapreneur, this startup can evolve into sustainable businesses that can be acquired, and these are called successful exit strategies, or alternatively, and more likely, decay and eventually shut down. So most startups that are done by entrepreneurs end up collapsing. So this brings up entrepreneurship. So entrepreneurship is essentially an individual, the entrepreneur, who balances the entrepreneurial spirit, the same as the entrepreneur, with a corporate structure. So instead of saying, I'm going to start out my own company, I'm going to wing it, I'm going to go on my own, I'm going to get some people, put some money together, you actually do this in the context and under the protection of a corporate structure. An entrepreneur is an innovator who creates a new product, service, just like an entrepreneur process, by leveraging protection afforded by a large corporate entity, or what is known as a highly reliable organization, or an HRO, which has all kinds of resources. An HRO is typically a big, bureaucratic, hierarchical, and increasingly risk-averse organization or institution that deals with complexity by strictly following standard operating procedures through mountains of manuals of operations. It sucks. You want to get something done in an HRO, it'll take you months and months and months of convincing people to get through this, because these have become so corporate. And here's a news flash. Medical schools, universities, hospitals have become HROs. And so there's a ton of barriers to be able to do anything innovative. at an institution like this. Now, entrepreneurship was first described by Gifford and Pinchot in the early 1970s, or in the late 1970s. It was then popularized in Time magazine with an article called "Here Come the Intrapreneurs," and it was actually quoted by Steve Jobs in Newsweek when he took over again. And he said the Macintosh team was a group of intrapreneurs going, in essence, back to the garage, but in a large company. And then you know what happened. It's called Apple, okay? And it was acknowledged as a word in 1992 by the American Heritage Dictionary. Now, I wrote a chapter in the Transplant Bible. They asked me to write a chapter about how to manage a transplant center based on what we had done at Northwestern. And I called it Transplant Center Management and Leadership, a case for structured intrapreneurship. And I reviewed at the time everything that had been written on entrepreneurship. I could find 7 references. There were no references. If you look at that chapter, there's almost no references. 3 of the references came from recent Harvard business reviews that have been written on the topic. And I learned a lot from reading those early papers. It really mapped out why we were at the stage where entrepreneurship was important and how we had gotten there. And it divided into 4 eras. The first era is the lone inventor. And I look back at transplant. This is Tom Starzl. This is a guy that just knew how to deal with failure after failure after failure. And he was allowed to do that in Denver. He was allowed to fail. He must have killed 100 patients trying to do the first liver transplants. There was an alternative. Same with kidney transplants. There was no dialysis. So you either got a kidney transplant or you died. So people were able to get away with a lot. So these were lone inventors, the John Nigerians, the Tom Starzls. Then hospitals became corporate labs. Less stifling corporate bureaucracy and more likely to tolerate experimental ethics. So think Pittsburgh, for transplant. Third area is where health systems become very corporate. Corporate culture, big companies, health systems, bureaucratic, hierarchical. And they just don't know how to handle at the fringes entrepreneurial exploration. IRBs. Tom Starzl used to say that IRBs are the devil in person. He didn't believe in IRBs. You know, when all the medications that we use today, there was no IRBs. He refused to get IRBs. He would just get the medication and try it on patients. When I used to round with him in the mid-1980s in Pittsburgh, he'd be giving a drug that came out of a syringe with no label. Patients were dropping like flies. You know, rejection, OKT3. What the hell is OKT3? You know, I don't know, some medication that just came out. No IRBs. But if it wasn't for that, we wouldn't be where we are today. You could not possibly do that and shouldn't do that today. But that's what happened. Hospitals became corporate entities. They became HROs. And now we're in a position where we're stuck with, we're in HROs. And so the key is to develop within those HROs these corporate catalysts. And, you know, they require business models and, you know, but you can take the scale of the organization, all the assets and resources of an organization like this one, and unleash innovation instead of shackle it. And that's up to your leaders. Your leaders are the ones that have to fight to create these, they're called mini firms, they're called corporate catalysts. It really is about decentralized strategic and innovation activities, promoting agility, hospitable to catalysts, and motivated by autonomy and a sense of purpose. Again, this was from a Harvard Business Review when I was writing this chapter. And this is kind of interesting. So this graph, I did a very quick search about articles on intrapreneurship starting in 1980. And you can see there was nothing in 1980. Remember 1982? And then look what happened. So when I wrote this chapter, I Googled intrapreneurship and I got maybe 20 hits. Just for, educate myself, a year ago, I Googled intrapreneurship. There were almost 100,000 hits. And in fact, Pinchot, the guy that described it, now has a blog that is one of the most popular blogs in entrepreneurship. So this is an area that has come of age because of the corporate structure of academic institutions. Phil Kotler, who was my professor at Kellogg, said entrepreneurs are encouraged to behave as entrepreneurs within the context of the resources of an HRO. In Great by Choice, I don't know how many of you followed Jim Collins. In his book, Great by Choice, he proposed that the most successful companies, he called them 10Xers, combine creativity and discipline. And that's the whole thing. You can be creative, you can be innovative, you can be crazy when it comes to innovation, but you have to marry it to the corporate discipline to be successful. And that's the difference between intrapreneurship and entrepreneurship, where you're just kind of winging it on your own. It combines the ability of individuals to transform an idea into a profitable finished product through assertive risk-taking and innovation. Again, with the protection and backing of all the resources of a large corporation. And there's all kinds of examples, that things that you use every day that came out of these mini firms. The most notable is the Post-it. 3M decided to have an entrepreneurial unit, and they came up with the Post-it. PlayStation, Oracle. So these are all examples of how entrepreneurship can really work. So what is it that makes entrepreneurship successful? It has to be disruptive innovation. It has to be the kind of innovation that completely disrupts the status quo to get the attention of the institution. Within, again, a corporate social responsibility. Risk-taking and failure are acceptable. In fact, they're encouraged. Because if you don't have a bunch of failures, it means you're not being disruptive enough in your innovation. And success is rewarded. The ability to sell and receive acceptance from the organization, the institution of an entrepreneurial idea is going to need help from others who have social capital at the institution. And that's why I said your leaders are the ones that have to be the advocates and the champions for this type of innovation, because they have trust equity with the decision makers. The organization cannot wall off the entrepreneur because it will block them from institutional resources and protection. But the entrepreneur cannot be corrupted or contaminated by the bureaucratic HRO culture. And that's kind of the tricky part. You operate, you've earned the right to do something crazy, but you've done it with the full support of the organization. And the institution accepts that there's a very, very high likelihood you're going to fail, and that's okay. As opposed to if you're an entrepreneur and you fail and you fall flat on your face, you're in bad trouble. In this case, you're not in bad trouble because you've got the institution behind you. Extremes are dangerous, yet you need to strike a very careful medium without corrupting either side. So as an entrepreneur, you can't be corrupted by the HRO, but you also can't make an attempt to corrupt the HRO and say, no, you got to throw away those standard procedures. You can't do that. You need that security. And this is another HBR thing that I thought was great, and it just spells out some essential steps to successful entrepreneurship, which have stood the test of time. And it's just a process. And the process is bringing yourself to accept the HRO and bringing the HRO to accept the fact that you're just different. So we talked about the traditional path for academic medicine. There's kind of a less traditional path if you are going to do these kinds of disruptive innovations. So same thing, you do research, you write papers, you do all the stuff that we've all done. But then instead of getting real funding, because the NIH is not going to fund this stuff, it's way too risky. You know, the big joke about the NIH is you do the experiment, you show that it works, and then you write your grant, and then it gets funded. Well, this is not what we're talking about here. We're talking about crazy. We're talking about disruptive. It won't fund it. So you have to look for other sources of funding. So you want to discover, you want to invent, you want to disrupt, you want to innovate, you want to become an entrepreneur, you want to register patents. I just recruited a chair of surgery to the University of Arizona from Stanford. He has 30 patents and 70 pending. That's what you need to be as a surgeon scientist today. It can't just be, well, I wrote 10 papers, 15 papers, and big journals. That's obviously needed, but it's a whole new culture of disruption. You have to register patents. You have to start and monetize a company or partner with industry to commercialize your product, to bring it to a patient. And you have to create an exit strategy, because if you don't, nobody will invest in your startup. They're all interested in, how do I make money? How do I get my 8x, 10x? So this person that I just recruited, he was running a fund for Stanford, and he just closed his second fund, returning 8x to investors after 18 months. So again, you have to be thinking about stuff that we used to think was dirty. We're not in this for the money. Well, you may not be in it for the money. You're in it for the right reasons. You want to get something to a patient. You want to discover, you want to innovate. But somebody has to make money on this, or you're not going to be able to do what you need to do. This will get you promoted, and it will get you tenure. And if you build a fund, just like the surgeon I just talked about, then you can get sponsored research agreements. So I funded our initial research in biomarker discovery at Northwestern by creating a company and then having the company support our biorepository to the tune of $2 million a year through a sponsored research agreement with Northwestern University. That agreement is still in place. When we sold the company, and I'll talk about that, part of selling the company is I wrote a $12.5 million grant over 5 years on my way out the door to go to the University of Arizona. And the entire bioinformatics program, the entire biorepository is now funded by that grant. So that's $2.5 million a year. Couldn't do that without a company. And no one's going to pay for that. The NIH will not pay for biorepositories. That has led to the creation of a number of biomarkers that are now commercialized. So you want to be an entrepreneur. You've used your social capital or somebody else's social capital. Your work has led to a new discovery, and you've taken it as far as you can take it with all the validation that's required, and I'll show you that, traditional funding mechanisms. Now you want to further develop and bring this discovery to a patient outside of a clinical trial. See, we're all, yeah, we got something, we're gonna do a clinical trial. So you enroll patients, it's paid for. All right, well, at some point, if it's any good, somebody else has to pay for that, whether it's Medicare or private payers. Well, how do you do that? How do you get that product to be paid for? You cannot bear the burden of entrepreneurism. You can't. The IP belongs to your institution. They're a partner in this. So you need to do this within the confines of the HRO. Again, this is entrepreneurship. You have to keep innovating under the protection of your institution. And you're always asking yourself, how do I monetize the development commercialization of my discovery while remaining in an academic setting? So I had a whole bunch of grants, and when we started the company, my first concern was that the NIH program officer was going to say, well, if you're going to start a company, we're not going to fund you anymore. And this is somebody that I had a 15-year relationship with. So I called her up, Nancy Bridges, NIAD. And I said, Nancy, thinking of starting a company, I really want to commercialize some of the work that we've done, but I'm worried that if I do that, you might not fund grants anymore. Her answer was, Mike, when we submit our report to Congress every year and ask for more money from Congress for the NIH, what do you think is the most important part of that many thousand-page report? I said, I have no idea. She said, the number of companies that have been spun out as a result of research funded by the NIH. Because what Congress does is it looks at this as returning dollars to the taxpayer. So you're creating jobs, people are paying taxes. This is their return on investment. That's the thing they look at the most. I never knew that. I always thought, if you start a company, the NIH will say, well, and it was kind of this eureka moment where it just made a lot of sense. NIH is your tax dollars. And if you're paying taxes, what do you want? You want an ROI. You want eventually a company to start out, create jobs, pay taxes. And so that was very important for me to understand. So you want to be an entrepreneur. Step one, create a company or partner with one. Two, you and the institution license the IP to that company. When I first heard this, I had no idea what this meant. So you've got the IP, you've got the intellectual property for this discovery. Your institution owns it. You create a company. What you do is you take that IP with your institution and you license it exclusively to your company. So your company can now go raise money based on this IP that belongs to your institution. And it's very easy to do. But you have to understand the logistics of that. And then you learn the difference between a grant application and a business plan. This was the hardest thing for me. I was so used to writing grants. I knew the formula, I could get anything funded. So, there were four things: scientific premise, scientific rigor, significance, overall impact. Still the same. Today, you write a grant, you better pay attention to these four things. Same thing applies when you're doing a business plan for a bunch of investors, except what goes in there is totally different. In your scientific premise, your background, you got all this scientific mumbo jumbo, very important. Investors, they don't care. They don't really care. They don't understand it. Typically they're not very smart. They just want to know, is there a need? Are we going to fulfill that need? And how many dollars is that going to translate into so I can get my ROI on my investment? That's the premise. It's not all the scientific stuff. It's a business plan. Scientific rigor. So when you do this, like study design, all the controls, and all the NIH stuff. Here, they just want to know, what's the research and development plan, and how does that jive with selling the product? Is there going to be an R&D pipeline? Some companies, they don't care about R&D, so we just want to sell product. You can't go there. You have to be able to, if you want to do this as a scientist, you want to couple the research and development with the ability to generate revenue. Significance. When you write a grant, it's all about wonderful effect on society and disease and all that kind of stuff. Business plan is marketing and sales plan based on market adoption and market share and margins. And finally, overall impact. You're writing a grant, likelihood of the proposal, if successful, to change people's health and life. Business plan, exit strategy. How do they get their money back? This is actually an example of when I transitioned to a business plan when we started the company called Transplant Genomics. And if you look at the table of contents, it looks nothing like a grant. But this is what we have to do. And then this is what the investors wanted to know. What's the ecosystem? And notice these are all companies. So is it a companion diagnostic? Is it, you know, how are the pharmas going to respond to this? Are they going to be interested? All has to do with exit strategies and leveraging assets from other companies. I would never would have written this into a grant. It would have got tossed out by the study section. So it's really different perspectives. Investors versus funding agencies. It's a willingness to invest depends on a whole bunch of stuff that you never think about when you're writing a grant. Strategic partnerships, that's the ecosystem. Who are your strategic partners? How do you leverage that? You got to worry about the providers. That's you guys. Are you guys going to use this test if we develop it? Are you guys going to use this device if we develop it? Regulators, Medicare, payers, people that are going to pay for it. So one thing is, are you going to use it? Second is, who's going to pay for it? And then institutional versus individual interests. You know, how progressive is the institution and its leaders with respect to commercialization? This is what the FDA uses as a framework. And you can see that this is, so you have to worry about the FDA, right? Because that's the regulator that's going to decide if your test is going to be approved or not. So you have to understand how they think. And look what's up there. It's context of use. I've never heard this term before. You want to develop a device or biomarker, you got to have a COU that is based on what the need is. So you have to find the need, the COU, and then you have to do benefit risk versus the standard of care. What is available today? And how is this better? And then you have to, depending on all of this, it defines what is the evidence that you need to convince these people that this test is something that needs to be approved. And then you go through a whole series of, it's a cyclical process. And then, you know, we all know about clinical validation. So you have to have external cohorts, you have to validate all this stuff. It's not just the stuff that you discover in. And then there's analytical validation. This would never, ever come up. It's like, okay, well, what happens if you use two different machines to do this test? What happens if you use two different manufacturers to manufacture the pieces that go into your device? So those are things that the FDA is very interested in. Reproducible, you know, it's not just what happened in your lab. How reproducible is this stuff if you change reagents, if you change machines? That takes a lot of money. And because you have to keep showing, if you're doing a CLIA lab or if you're doing whatever you're doing with the FDA or any other regulatory body, you have to show that it's not just in your hands, it's in anybody's hands. And the interpretation in any provider's hands is going to lead to the same result. And this goes to the evidentiary criteria for qualification in different categories. This is specific to biomarkers. So this is the stuff you never think about when you're trying to figure out the science of it. But without this, you can never get to that next step. This is why you have to start a company, because this costs millions and millions of dollars. Before we sold our company, our burn rate was $300,000 a month. $300,000 a month doing all this stuff. I mean, there's just no way you can, I mean, there's no institutions that support that. And so, but without that, no patient is ever going to benefit from your discovery. So at University of Arizona, we have a pretty good tech transfer office. You know, it's called TLA, Tech Launch Arizona. And they asked me to do a fireside chat to talk about all this stuff. And so there's all of these sessions that break down the process of this. And they said, if it comes from the dean, every department chair will pay attention to this. And every department chair will recognize and reward people that are doing this kind of thing. So it's online. So I've tried to give you a sense that, you know, research is research, but that how you develop research has really changed for a couple of reasons. Number one, medical schools and academic medical centers do continue to play an essential role as laboratories where major medical discoveries and advances occur, but they have become HROs, and there's no going back. As a result of the increased adoption of this corporate culture of AMCs, at the fringes, entrepreneurial exploration has become less well accepted, leading to the need for adopting entrepreneurial corporate catalysts or mini-firm approaches to research, especially translational and clinical research that involve biotech, diagnostic, and therapeutic breakthroughs in the academic setting. Decreased funding from federal sources combined with a decreased appetite for exploratory risk in academic institutions have created the need for increased awareness, acceptance, and understanding of alternative funding approaches, as well as less traditional career pathways for academic positions. There's a clear need for decentralized strategic activities in AMCs that promote an agility hospitable to mission-driven leaders who can corral institutional resources outside their traditional span of control to address specific areas of innovation. These are more likely to require compelling business plans rather than scientific plans, and the scale of the institution should unleash disruptive innovation rather than shut.